What's up, Book Talk? I have recently finished Stone of Farewell by Tad Williams, the second book in Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn. And if you're watching this review and you're wondering why you should read it, maybe just come along with me on this journey of how it makes me feel, right? And maybe how I feel will invoke something in you. Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn is like the literary fantasy equivalent of coming home in middle school on a winter break in the year of 2011, turning on your Xbox 360, booting up Skyrim, and playing it for the first time. And if you understand that feeling, if you understand what it is to come home to something warm and wonderful, something that you've lost because you're older now, where you feel this great joy, but also this melancholy because, you know, this was a great bygone era and you're never going to be able to recapture it, but you appreciate it for what it was when it happened in your life, the Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn might just work for you. Because those are the emotions that this series invokes in me. I've never read this series before, obviously. But it reminds me so deeply of childhood in a sense that I've rarely felt in any other fantasy series. And I don't mean that in the childhood sense of, oh, it's written for children or anything like that. No, I just mean it feels like nostalgic in the best kind of way. You know, growing up, I've always been a pretty big fan of fantasy. I read Chronicles of Narnia growing up. I had, before even Chronicles of Narnia, a bunch of those magical treehouse books, and my favorites were always the King Arthur ones. I loved King Arthur growing up. You know, I love kind of traditional fantasy. I like the princesses, I like the castles, I like the dragons, I like the mythical creatures, I like when magic's weird and esoteric and it happens and it's not explained. I like when kitchen boys and when orphans, you know, who seem like, you know, screw-ups in their daily lives, go out on an adventure and they change and they turn into men and they come back and they're so different than when they went out. And it's just this beautiful journey. I've realized as I've kind of gotten more and more into fantasy that as much as I really enjoy the series that subvert my expectations and that do fantasy very differently, you know, I love Malazan because it's so different than everything else I've read. I love A Song of Ice and Fire because it has very real and very complicated characters. And I love, you know, First Law because it spits in the face of fantasy and it says this isn't how people would act in an actual fantasy setting. And, you know, this is just not realistic, you know. As much as I enjoy that, I've also learned that I think, truthfully, I'm a romantic when it comes to my view on fantasy, and by extension, human nature. As much as I like to, you know, at times view myself as a pessimist and enjoy, you know, the darker series, there's also a deep part of me that really enjoys when fantasy just has good men and women fighting for good causes because it's right. I don't need series that are constantly saying, oh, family's crap and nothing's good in the world, and yeah, maybe the good guys win, but are really any better off. As much as I can enjoy that, I also sometimes want to read an author that just loves fantasy and they love how romantic it can be, and that is something that Williams does so well, because there is some incredibly dark stuff in Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, especially when you take the time to think about it. There are some messed up characters and there are some messed up situations. Characters are being assaulted, they are being killed, there is dark magic at play, there is torture, there are things I can't even talk about without getting banned on TikTok that happen in this series. But also, despite all of that incredibly dark stuff that Williams could focus on and really just hit your head over, you know, over and over again, there's also this sense of, despite all the dark stuff that's over in this corner, there's also hope. And that hope doesn't die until we let it die. That we as humans, no matter how dark stuff is, no matter how messed up we are, there's always a chance for redemption. And that is something that I enjoy immensely about fantasy. Because, yeah, the real world's a messed up place. And sometimes you kind of do want to just escape into a world that, despite it having messed up stuff in it, still feels hopeful. And that is something Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn just does so well, in my opinion. The only other series I can really compare this to, actually 2 series I can compare this to, is Lord of the Rings and Wheel of Time. And, you know, I think that Williams looked at Lord of the Rings and its general groundwork that it built for the fantasy genre, and he's not just ripping it off, but he is paying homage to it. He is looking at what Tolkien did and seeing that, hey, I can write fantasy where it has all these cliches and make it different and make it unique and make it beautiful in a way that is going to connect with a modern audience. You know, Lord of the Rings, I appreciate it for everything that it's done for the genre. And I wish I liked it more. I really do. But Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn is like it for me. Like, if I had a series that I just thought, yeah, this is like my Lord of the Rings, it might be Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn. Because it nails all the feelings that I want to feel while reading Lord of the Rings. You know, when I watched Lord of the Rings as a kid for the first time, as movies, it was this epic experience that I just I don't have the time to relate to. You know, I can't explain what watching those films for the first time at 10 years old did to me, and how it made me love fantasy even more than I had. But, you know, if there was a series that recaptured my youthful love for fantasy that I felt playing Skyrim, that I felt watching Lord of the Rings for the first time, that I felt even earlier when I read Chronicles of Narnia and the Treehouse series, it is Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn. I mean, if Wheel of Time is my peak fantasy, it does everything that I want to see in fantasy, and it just nails it, Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn, it's like right there, man. It's like right there. And there are some ways that Tab Williams does it better, because he seems more romantic when it comes to his use of language, when it comes to just being willing to get weird with it at points. Not to say Wheel of Time doesn't get weird. He explores different cultures and languages and the themes of religion in ways that I just really appreciate. And again, Wheel of Time, #1, right? But man, Williams is like, he's as good. He's certainly as good in certain areas. I think Robert has him in other areas, but in some areas, man, he's just as good, if not better. And I think that's the biggest compliment I can give this series. Because if you're in the same category as The Wheel of Frickin' Time, my favorite series of all time, a series I put over A Song of Ice and Fire, which for like 7 years was my favorite fantasy I've ever read in my entire life, you're in great company. And Stone of Farewell is an excellent addition to this series. I mean, I wish that I had the ability to communicate to you exactly how good this series is. I just don't have the words, because it's one of those things where you got to just sit down and you got to read it, and it's not going to be for everyone. This is a slow series, and the characters aren't, you might not connect with all of them, and you might not connect with the world or whatever, but for me, man, I mean, this is like coming home. This is like coming home to a world that I just have missed my entire life, having never read it. Stone of Farewell is going to be a 9.5 out of 10 for me. I mean, it's just excellently done. And this, I'm certain by the end of this trilogy, this is probably going to be my favorite trilogy of all time. It already is. But yeah, this is one of the best fantasy series ever. Period. I mean, just excellent. And I'm only at book 2.